And we continue learning Dirshu Mishnah Berurah, the Devarim, the Halachos Anoigim Seudah. We begin a new Siman Kof Ayin Zayin, which the Machaber coins as the Devarim Abayim B'Soicha Seudah V'Achar Seudah Madinam. We have a crossbreed, a hybrid of entities that come both during the meal and after the meal, and what are their halachos? Says the Mechaber in Tzival Dvarma Ba'im B'Zechad Suda Meim Dvarma Ba'im Machos HaSuda. Something that comes during a meal, if it's something that's part of the meal, Dainu Dvarim Shederech Like Boya Suda Aleihem, something which is normal to Kaveya Suda on them, Lalafes Emes Abbas, they're eaten with bread, Kigoin, Basar V'Dagim U'Beitzim, V'Yerakos U'Gvina V'Daisa, U'Mine Meluchem. That if which are basically food type of items. Food type of items. Continues the Mechaber. Afilu oichlam beloy pas. All these entities, even if you eat them without bread, ain't tuna brach lefneim de brachzam moitzi b'tartem. So it's not that you have to actually eat them with the bread, as long as they are meal foods and you eat them during the meal. Even though you don't eat them with the bread proper, the bread patzers them. This is the basic halacha that we all know, that bread patzers all the food in a meal. You don't have to make a bracha achroina because benching patzers. What does that mean? It's not normal to eat them with bread. Fruits. Then what? Then it depends, says the Mechaber. Why? You don't have to make a bracha achreina since they are during the meal. Therefore, benching will pat them. Vim. If you first took a bite of the fruit with bread, and then at the end you ate bread. Again, the beginning, okay, so that the Ramah throws in a pas. Even if in between you ate some fruit without bread, then it doesn't need a bracha at all. So this is really going to be, as we all realize, the big dessert shaila. As we're discussing over here, the Mechaber seems to say black and white, fruit and items which are not meal items, I don't know, let's say candy, then you need to make a bracha on them. Says the Mishnah Berurah, oatmeal is not to use with pas. So then why don't you make a bracha on it? Over here really defines with precision what does it mean lelafes behemet zapas kunu talmid de Rabbeinu Yoiner Zarua Shar Paiskim that. And the Shartzin over here actually takes issue, and he says, "Lashon amachaber deklala kol batam dem lafzim mezapas is dachuk," because it's not all about lafzim mezapas. Says Mishmur, that's one way if you eat something with pas, but there's another way that something could just be an ikr. Something could just be an ikr. Why? Because it's an ikr asuda, and something which is an ikr asuda, the halacha is does not get a bracha. Because it's considered that it's there machmas hasuda. For what didn't call me suda's pas. All cooked dishes, which are normal to come in middle of a bread meal, says the Mishnah Berurah, you don't make a bracha because these are all ikar hasudas, bread, chicken, rice, all the food items that we eat during a meal. You do not make a bracha on any of these items, even if it's not actually properly eaten with bread, but they're considered meal items. Even if you then eat them below pas, you've got the base as mishmura. It's the ikar asuda. It's tafel, it's auxiliary to the bread. Therefore, all of these items, what's the halacha? The halacha is you do not make a bracha on them. Paitarta, and furthermore, they're pater by birchas hamazon. Menu chavis lachol pas elo eichal ma pas kedei lepatra. And let's say you just have a little bread just to pater up the rest of the meal. It's not simple. If you don't want to eat the bread, if you less than a kezayis, and now you start to realize how critically important it is to eat a kezayis of bread, aside for the actual shiloh of the kezayis, and you're able to bench, we're seeing over here that it might not even patter up the rest of your meal. Or perhaps, given the derech ha'ilam nekboy sudal pas, berach zambas, put out the chol then maybe it's the bracha itself, it's always batters. Valkein kasu, if you're just having a bite of bread to batter everything else, says the Mishnah Berurah, one should not do that. Unless, of course, does pass. I guess in a similar vein would be just make sure you have enough bread. If you have the ksayis, if you have the kabeya, then automatically everything is tafel to it. Now, what were the examples of items which are non-Seudah items? Says Mishnah Berurah, fruits, dates. Says Mishnah Berurah, Sivkatan, Dalid, v'chein kol davar shabarak lekinuach v'loy lasbia. It's not coming to fill you up. He says Mishnah Berurah, let's say the peiros were on your table. Maybe it's Rosh Hashanah and you have the apples on the table. Afilu ein mevushalim kam poit kam kinei napas poit hartam. Let's say you cooked the fruit with the meat, you put some apples inside your chicken, and now you want to eat the apples separately. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Masha mikam achrein desar levar chalem to make a bracha on it. The ein apeiros nasim tefilin la'abasar, because the fruit does not become auxiliary to the meat. So when it comes to something cooked with the meat, the chayadam in that case is mekel. You do not make a bracha. He says it's tafel to the meat. The Yad Ketana goes with, like the Mishnah Berurah wants to say, that you do not make a bracha even on these apples that were cooked with the chicken. An apple tzimis, ome agasim shekarin berin, nerin shkoli karnim boin lemozin asuda. So says the Sefer Yad Ketana, maybe this is like a apple kugel or something like that. That just because it's an apple doesn't mean it's inherently not part of the meal. No, could be you're making it in a mannerism that it actually is part of the meal itself. But you still will not have to make a bracha on them. So what do you do when you want to eat the compote, etc.? Take a regular uncooked apple, etc., and make a bracha on it. Let's say you don't have that. The first bite should be with bread, and this last bite should be with bread. Every other bite does not have to be with bread, as was clear from the Ramah. But you have to take a little bite of bread to start, a little bite of bread to close. Ayin sham. Says Mishnah Berurah, compote is not this shayla, because compote is clearly a dessert that would certainly need a bracha, says the Mishnah Berurah. However, im oichel chazeres lettuce oisenu batzal im basar hinas tafel basar basal lechem, then it is a tafel, and then you will not need a bracha. Ayin lekaman simin kuf samachas. The sham nisvar lini pas kisti niksheichel bem sa Seudah. Berach samazin paitartam. The lini berach samazin it's following in the Seudah. Tkim she'asal levarich al kol ma she'oichel. Kam ze nichlal yimai. So it's only a bracha rishayna that you have to make in these apples and desserts, but not a bracha achroina. V'im b'tchilas achilas ratzleim. Shetchilas achilas al peiros mabas. You take a bite with bread. But says Mishpur, you also have to have in mind, you need it all with bread. The Seudah makes it part of the meal, but the Seudah, the Ein Sarch Bracha Kenal. Kol Zedav says Mishmur Shavalav is Bemzapas Loli Kinuach, it's part of the meal. Demavu Rakli Kinuach, if it's clearly a dessert. Av Shaichli mixed as Pasachil Vesoif, Loi Mahadi. So the Shabur over here comes along, it says, the Eitzah that many think doesn't work. If it's a proper dessert, you can't eat it with bread because it's a dessert. Masheicha B'loi Pas, Sarach Bracha. V'gam Loi Mayri, Kisheikar Kviyos. Excuse me. It only won't work if you have part of it with bread, because then the part that you don't have in bread automatically is a dessert. And Mishmur is teaching us to lump this over here. How does it work eating with bread? It's not simple that if you eat with bread, it makes it part of the meal, and then you have a little bit of bread at the beginning, a little bit of bread at the end. Everything in the middle is part of the Seudah. That would be much simpler. No, says Mishnah Berurah, if it's a suffix food, then you could do that. But if it's a food that's clearly a dessert, the only will work is having every single bite with bread. Because once you don't, that one bite without bread needs a bracha. Can't be that your actual Seudah is on these fruits. If it's mamish your Seudah, then one bite of bread with it would work because it's not a dessert. Sivkat Taz says Mishbura. If you didn't have in mind to eat more bread, then you have to make a bracha on the peiros beforehand. Ein and tuna brachas have cut in yod afterwards. Achrayim kasu d'roi lizer lechatchili shovel lefana peiros b'tech hasuda lelafes behemes apas. Mr. Brura quotes the Bach Shalot Taz Magen Avram should be machmer to eat with bread. Shavarch b'tchili aleim kodim shachla imapas. If they bring you fruit during the meal, excuse me, that's not what he said. If they bring you fruit during the meal, you should first eat it before kodim shechlam imapas. And then afterwards you can eat it. Bein imapas, bein beloy pas. Kish me shoyn this every day filo moichal betchlev seven pas. Im moichal bem so beloy pas achlevarch. Ubedi even lo berch betchila motolachol. Shir lachol gam le seven pas. Am me maker kvies Seudah yisa mit chilala peiros. Then also kuliyama filo moichal acher kach beloy pas. Ain't achlevarch because that's your ikar Seudah which causes of Siv Gimel as we'll see. Machal pashtida shemula and peiros. It's a dish with fruit inside. Ein zelavarch la peiros and follow him the kamach because then it's part of the flour. Ein lasim kusam meches b'mishta brura. So as we're seeing over here, these are not simple gedarim and qualifications. Exactly what is going to get this din of a dessert food, etc. Let's just see some of the Dirshu. This is a proper World War massive sugya. You got to see be'iyah and you got to listen to shiurim, etc., etc. Let's see some of the Dirshu. Says the Dirshu. Number two over here, he says it's tough. Now let's see the one where he talks about ice cream. Yeah, Dirshu over here, number 7 says, what's going on with ice cream? We're trying to figure out what's a dessert and what's not a dessert. So says Dirshu, Kabi Galida. Says the Shevet HaLevi, you have to make a bracha on a meal. Why? Because it's coming like kinuach. It's not coming as part of the meal. Similarly, Rav Elyashiv says the same. And Rosh Zaman Arbach says the same with regarding a kartiv. I don't know what type of dish that is. However, on the other hand, you have the Arlet Sion that says, no, it's considered a liquid. That's the problem. It's sort of ices and ice cream. It's very good. It's a dessert, but it's a drink. It's a liquid. It's just a frozen liquid. Therefore, you don't make a bracha on them during the meal, even though it might be as a kinuach, but lamaisa, it's a drink. Only if it has some eggs in it or a jelly, that's going to be considered something you make a bracha on. So what's going on over here is the Dirshu is pointing out, aside from the regular fight by desserts, when it comes to ices and ice cream, there's a totally separate fight that maybe it's called a drink. Of course, for that, you could easily pater that with a candy, make the shackle on the candy, and pater up your ice cream. Now the Dirshu continues here with a shtickle problem. What happens if you have shkedei marak? You have the soup nuts during your meal, like kinuach ba'alma, you're just snacking on them, and you don't have them together with the soup. And this is something that is done, in every single household in Klal Yisrael that has soup nuts. Says Rav Elyashiv, You don't need to make a bracha on them, a big chiddush. I don't know if it's a big chiddush, but that's what Yasha says. And the reason is, kafi, shetzara, you don't have to make a bracha. And then the Dirshu just points out, but of course, Rav Yashiv is a maskim that if you have bisli or you have another snack, of course he holds there you make a bracha. It's dafka over here by the soup nuts. He says you don't. The reason is because the soup nuts are considered part of the meal, and therefore you don't make a bracha. No, but just part of the problem is that people actually nash even when they don't have soup on soup nuts. But okay, Rav Yashiv is saying soup nuts, shkedi marak, or by, I think some people call them croutons, maybe in English, have a din of a Seudah type of food, and therefore you wouldn't have to make a bracha on them. And finally, we'll just end with the words of the Shalah, that everything we go derech ha'ilam, and therefore, peiros, you're going to have to make a bracha on them, says the Dirshu, even if you eat them for sviyah. So to the opposite, if you're having fish and meat, they're always going to be part of the meal, even if you make, I don't know, some sweet meat pizza for dessert, or meat, I don't know what, candy meat, sounds fabulous for dessert, still inherently called a Seudah type of food. Obviously, desserts in general are world war, which we're not really getting involved in. We'll pick it up from Sif Beis in the next shiur.